So, I've been on a bit of a vampire binge lately, mostly because I've been in the thick of writing a novel with vampires and also working on a couple of YouTube video projects about Dracula and other vampire movies and such. As you can imagine, this means I've been consuming what could be considered an excessive quantity of vampire media as of late. I have on an extended hiatus from another Vampire Diaries watch because that show is just a lot at times, and I've gotten a little annoyed with it, and I had to just take a break. But I'll probably get back to that soon. And I've also been slowly rewatching True Blood because I have a lot to say in general about True Blood, and I am planning on eventually making a full series retrospective about that as soon as I have the time to devote to it. But there's a particular aspect about it that's been nagging me at the back of my mind since I first saw season two. And after watching Claudia's storyline more recently in the interview with the vampire show, I just had to put all of my other video projects on hold for a little while to try to articulate once and for all my issue with the character of the teenage vampire in fiction. Case study number one, Twilight. For better or for worse, it's impossible to deny that the Twilight Saga is a cultural touchstone. We'd be talking about the questionable treatment of teenage vampires here today if it wasn't for Stephanie Meyer's success and the dominance of paranormal romances in the young adult market and on TV in the late 2000s and 2010s. Probably not. So it really should go without saying at this point that the romantic relationships, among many, many other things in the Twilight books and movies, are just a bit problematic to say the least. Everyone and their grandmother has already called Edward a pedo and a creep for being over 100 years old and dating a 17-year-old, to the point that it's a criticism that's gotten a bit, well, old. Not that it's necessarily without merit, of course, and I'm the last person you would call a Twilight apologist, but without grounding it in the proper context, it can often be a criticism without nuance. I wanted to start with Twilight, not just because it's probably the first thing that comes to mind for many people when you say the words teen vampire romance, but also because it's about as pure and straightforward of an example of the trope that there is that also contains some surprising layers to it that casual critics, haters, and fans alike often overlook. And by layers, I mean that I could pretty much make a whole iceberg video about how the deeper you delve into the abysmal depths of Stephanie Meyer's imagination, the more screwed up the bizarre and disturbing themes of age, youth, and maturity and power dynamics presented in her novels reveal themselves to be. And as with most of the other examples we'll see throughout this video, I'm inclined to believe that none of these layers were intentional, just a consequence of an author giving surface level attention to the words she was writing while not fully grasping the deeper meaning behind them. Let's start with the basics. Edward Cullen is a creep, there's really no denying that. Putting aside the vampiric abilities and supernatural age difference, he's a stalker, he's controlling, he's emotionally manipulative, and his relationship with Bella is all around toxic. I'm just getting that all out of the way because I'm not here to discuss Bella and Edward's relationship in terms of the dangerous, abusive bad boy love interest trope. Because even if he was the sweetest and least problematic guy in the world, the fact remains that Bella Swan begins the series as a 17-year-old high schooler who jumps into a relationship rather quickly with a guy, her same age. He just so happens to have been the same age for a really, really long time. Well, that's the crux of the issue that so many people have with Twilight and its spiritual successors, isn't it? Because Edward Cullen is not technically 17. He's 104 and old enough to be her great grandfather. He just so happened to have been turned into an unaging immortal as a 17-year-old boy 87 years before meeting Bella. He's certainly old enough to have grown and matured to full adulthood several times over. Yet not only does he fall obsessively in love with an actual teenager, he meets her when he's a student at the same high school. And it's not like Edward and the other younger Cullens are infiltrating Forks High for some kind of contrived urban fantasy reason, like having to protect Bella or someone else from nefarious supernatural forces or spying on some other Halloween monster disguised as the as the gym teacher or something. Nope, they're just in high school because they want to be, I guess. The author said so, and they're still just teenagers despite being centuries old. And what else are teenagers supposed to do but go to high school, right? This shaky premise has become one of the biggest running jokes surrounding the Twilight franchise, and I too can't help but wonder why the Cullens don't just say they're homeschooled when they all stand out like a bunch of weirdos. Edward thinks of his classmates as a bunch of stupid children, and Jasper in particular should be way too much of a deadly liability to be allowed within 100 yards of a school due to his struggle with controlling his bloodlust. I mean, yeah, test taking must be a breeze and you've learned all this shit before, but can you seriously imagine any of these people sitting down to do calculus homework? Yes, I know the answer to why they're still going to high school is plot convenience, and I do have to give Meyer the tiniest bit of credit here because despite what the movies might have you believe, it is explained slightly more clearly in the books that Edward and his vampire siblings have not only been repeating high school for decades and decades. Edward, at least, has also gone to college multiple times and even went to medical school twice. But here's where we run into the first problem with the concept of an immortal teenager, at least in the way that Stephanie Meyer writes it, and taking into account the inherent contradiction of being an immortal teenager. Yes, Edward has a lot of education, albeit a lot of it very redundant, and a lot more lived experience than the literal adolescents who surround him, Bella included. And the same also holds true for his college and medical school classmates anytime he graduates high school and moves on to higher education. But from what I can remember, Meyer never mentions Edward putting all of that endless learning to use in a career path, despite how boring and annoying he seems to find repeating high school yet again to be whenever we're in his head in Midnight Sun. I don't know. I guess it could really just be that pursuing as much knowledge as possible is his passion, despite his contempt for secondary education. And honestly, I get that at least. Repeating high school would drive me crazy too. And since he can certainly afford it, there isn't inherently a problem with having your vampire characters spend most of their eternity earning degrees in whatever field strikes their fancy. Whether or not this is what Meyer intended with Edward is anyone's guess, though, because he doesn't read to me like someone with an endless thirst for learning. He strikes me as a pretentious, cranky, spoiled rich kid who secretly resents that he never made his own way in the world. And there's a part of me that can't help but feel a tiny bit bad for him because it's implied that the reason why he couldn't make his own way, so to speak, and actually put those degrees to use is because he's stuck in the body of a 17-year-old forever. He can pull off being older than his physical age only up to a certain point, and presumably pretending to be too old would be met with disbelief or at least prevent him from being taken seriously as a doctor or some other professional. Ignoring the fact for a moment that this really should be a non issue for Twilight vampires because they're so overpowered and impossible to kill that by all rights they should not be in hiding and should probably have taken over the world by now, how depressing would it be to literally be stuck in the body of your teenage self forever? Forget all the killing and blood drinking angst. If I'd been turned into a vampire at 17, I'd be a mopey little bitch too, especially if it doesn't come with mind control powers like in the Vampire Diaries or True Blood to ease one's way through life. Being inhumanly beautiful and super strong only gets you so far if you can only pass for your early 20s at most. And yeah, I imagine that probably wouldn't matter much to a lot of vampires who are mostly presented as being pretty evil compared to the Cullens and don't generally care about trying to blend in with human society. But Edward and his family are supposed to care, so yeah, for as many advantages that being a Meyer Pyre would bring, if you're the type to want to hold on to your humanity, not kill people, and use your immortality to live life to the fullest, then it would suck to be a perpetual teenager and possibly never be able to explore your full potential as an adult because people will only ever see you as very young. Unfortunately, Stephanie Meyer is too wrapped up in crafting her ideal romance and her perfect fantasy of being young and hot forever to explore these ideas in any depth. And why bother exploring the actual implications of being made immortal at such a young age when her main character's own ambitions don't extend any further than becoming a vampire and being with her true love forever? Honestly, one thing that struck me as both hilarious and unsettling that I somehow never thought of in the 15 or 16 years or so since I first read Twilight is the idea that now that Belle's a vampire, the perfect sparkly forever that she has to look forward to is probably just going to be more of the same shit that the Cullens have already been doing for decades. By which I mean the joy of repeating high school with her in laws over and over. Except now she herself has her half vampire daughter, who will canonically age rapidly until she is approximately physically 17 and then stop. So, in just a few years' time, she and her parents will, for all intents and purposes, be the same age as each other forever. So, what are they all gonna do? Go to high school together and pretend to be siblings? Ew. And don't even get me started on Jacob being magically compelled to fall in love at first sight with a baby and basically become brainwashed into being her slave because of the whole imprinting thing. It's just a whole mess, all right? I don't want to get into it. You see what I mean about Meyer not thinking critically at all about her writing and its weird implications? She's clearly enamored with the concept of being young and beautiful forever. A little too much so, if you ask me, but her view of what this actually entails is too shallow to allow for any meaningful engagement with what it means to be a vampire in her world. Being a Meyer Pyre is just pure awesome, full stop, which I find pretty boring. And once you dig beneath the shallow facade of her written words, you start to uncover some even more unfortunate implications beyond simply looking like a teenager forever, starting with the fact that being 17 or 18 years old forever seems to be the sweet spot of vampiric age for her, and it's a little creepy. On one hand, I kind of get it. Twilight is a young adult book written for teen audiences, so it's a given that the main characters are also going to be teenagers, or technically not, but also kind of still technically teenage immortals. But like, the books, it was hard not to notice the almost fetishized way she talks about their eternal youth, especially with Bella's constant fretting over being older than Edward by only a year. In a better written series, this fear of aging could have been an actual character flaw of hers to explore and overcome. But nope, here she gets turned 2 days shy of her 19th birthday, freaks out about not wanting to acknowledge her human age for 5 seconds, and is saved from the terrible, horrible fate of being a decrepit 20-year-old crone by being preserved at the pinnacle of youth and hotness forever. But being turned into a vampire as a teen is one thing. After all, it's kind of a given with the trope that your vampire characters are simply going to stop aging at whatever age they died at. It's where she got creative with the concept of half vampires that the themes of age, maturity, and beauty ideals in relation to age start to get extremely questionable and deeply unsettling. Per her own canon, human vampire hybrids gestate rapidly in the womb and then bust out of their alien style after only a month, at which point they've already developed a fully adult mentality and intelligence. They continue to grow rapidly after birth and are considered fully grown after only 7 years once they've reached the approximate physical age of 17. Now, the age of adulthood varies a lot across cultures and time periods, and it's a tricky concept to define in general since the age limits that our society puts on certain signifiers of adulthood are pretty arbitrary. Like, why have we in the United States decided that 18 is generally considered legal adulthood and the age at which one can be drafted into the military, but 16-year-olds can drive, you have to wait until you're 21 to drink alcohol or gamble, and oftentimes you can't rent a car until you're 24 or 25. So, in that sense, I guess there technically isn't anything too strange about deciding on 17 or its magical rapid aging equivalent thereof being the signifier of adult maturity for a half vampire. But I'm not here to be charitable. I'm here to tell you that I do think it's fucking strange that Meyer seems to think that the late teens are when one reaches the peak of their physical maturity, mental maturity, and also attractiveness. Like, thank God Renesmee won't have to keep aging because it's really just all downhill from your late teens, am I right? And wow, I really hope this isn't a genuine reflection of Meyer's real life views on aging, because there are few things more depressing than the thought of peaking in high school. And since Meyer doesn't consider the implications of her own writing, I would assume that this is meant to be the peak of mental maturity as well, because just what the hell are we meant to infer from Renesmee being born with the intelligence and awareness of an adult? Overlooking the sheer horror of a literal adult baby for a moment, this bit of sloppy world building reveals just how little Meyer understands about the human mind. To be fair, most of us don't understand it as well as we like to pretend we do either. Lots of people these days love to throw around the factoid that the brain isn't fully developed until age 25, without grasping the nuances underlying that statement. Brain development is a lifelong process. It doesn't mean that once you hit 25, you're stuck the way you are forever and aren't ever capable of growth or change. It doesn't mean that people in their early 20s should be treated as adolescents rather than as adults, and it certainly doesn't mean that for example, a relationship between a 23-year-old and a 26-year-old or whatever is automatically problematic. And yes, I get that the fast growing adult baby thing is magic and doesn't have to abide by the rules of science, and it's not like there hasn't been folklore and mythology about various creatures and deities who sprang into existence as fully formed adults. But it's been a point of contention for many readers because Meyer doesn't seem to get what it means to be a mentally, emotionally, fully actualized grown-up, and is especially bad at articulating what it means regarding her little demon spawn. Was she imagining that Renesmee was born with the mind of a fully developed 25-year-old? Or since she's meant to stop physically aging at the equivalent of 17, does she have the brain of a late teenager as a newborn? Is her brain actually capable of further maturing over time? Would she go through an accelerated puberty with all the hormone fueled emotional changes that entails? Frankly, I'm skeptical that she would intend for baby Renesmee to be mentally more mature than Bella. Not because that would be weird or anything, she already crossed that boundary a long time ago. No, I just think it's more likely that Meyer either has no clear idea of what she meant by adult mentality, which is pretty clearly demonstrated by the fact that she's extremely inconsistent about Renesmee acting as an adult or acting as a child, or that she intended her to be more or less on the intelligence level of a teenager and that her body just needed a few years to catch up. Because if Renesmee were to be mentally and emotionally on the level of someone 25 or older, then that might imply that she's more mature than Bella. And I don't think Meyer is all that comfortable with the thought of her precious self insert not being considered a fully mature grown up by the ripe old age of 18. To me, Meyer's conception of half vampires as being instant adults, just add water, reads almost like her personal thesis statement on maturity and age, albeit a completely unintended one. Bella Swan is a static character who doesn't undergo any kind of personal growth journey. She doesn't learn anything or change in any meaningful way. Her only intended character flaw was her low self esteem, which was instantly fixed by becoming a perfect vampire who is superior to all humans. What should be a coming of age story in my mind on the surface isn't one at all because the main character is not required to self actualize or come into her own before being handed everything she ever wanted on a platter. Even as a high school junior, Bella was already mature enough to be making life altering decisions at the drop of a hat with no lasting consequences. Her daughter, Renesmee, is just a hyper distillation of Meyer's inability or unwillingness to engage with the hard but necessary parts of growing up, and suggests that perhaps she doesn't find the inherent messiness of being a teenager to even be all that necessary or inherent. You know, despite the fact that her characters do actually frequently embody the stereotype of the bratty, vapid, self absorbed teen. Yes, Bella does plenty of impulsive, irrational, and just plain stupid things throughout the series that you might expect from a 17 or 18-year-old, and she's constantly overflowing with the kind of melodrama that you'd expect from a teenager, too. But there's always that disconnect between what we're shown Bella doing and thinking and what we're told about how we should perceive her. Her alleged maturity is often given the not like other girls her age treatment, along with a hefty dose of parentification by way of her being the one to cook for and care for her parents. Her own mom even refers to her as a 40-year-old in an 18-year-old's body at one point, if I remember correctly. She doesn't vibe with her high school classmates, which is partially why she's drawn to the Cullens. But when you really look at how much Meyer emphasizes that Bella doesn't fit in with her peers, it's hard not to get the impression that it's a personal failing on the part of the other kids of Forks High School for simply choosing to not be more mature like Bella and the Cullens. That's not to say that growing up isn't also largely a matter of conscious effort and hard work. But for all that Meyer likes to claim that her supernatural creatures are rooted in real life science, She has a very poor grasp on the physiological and psychological reasons why adolescents are the way that they are. She takes it for granted that being at or on the cusp of legal adulthood means that a person is now fully mentally and emotionally mature and that they've more or less reached the pinnacle of their personal growth. Naivete about the world, still developing critical thinking skills, heightened emotional vulnerability, and indecisiveness about one's goals and desires are just mere personality flaws. It should really be the simplest thing in the world to choose to leave them behind in childhood once you hit 18 and finally catch up to where Bella and crusty old Edward already are, because it's not like either of them have ever made a single reckless decision in their entire lives. Hence why we're not supposed to be on Charlie's side when he objects to his daughter making such hasty decisions as running away twice because of a guy, getting married right out of high school to the same guy, and supposedly adopting an infant a month after getting married when she's never expressed an interest in having kids. At least, that's my takeaway from Meyer's writing. Speaking of crusty old Edward, though, that finally brings me around to the main point of all this. Is it problematic for a century-old vampire to date a 17-year-old? And the answer is, I guess it depends on your interpretation of Meyer's canon. Hey, I did tell you not to expect any objective answers in this video. As for my personal feelings, I'm honestly kind of torn. I legitimately hate both Edward and Bella so much as a fictional couple and think that there are so many other ways in which their relationship is fucked up that it largely overshadows the age difference to me. And I'm so over my obsessive anti Twilight phase at this point that I'd be perfectly happy to say that these two self centered idiots deserve each other and move on with my life. Honestly, the reason I started writing this video essay in the first place is mainly to talk about the Vampire Diaries and True Blood, but oops, it looks like my brief intro segment about Twilight exploded into a dissertation length rant that's almost half the script, so I guess I have to finish what I started now. In all seriousness, though, I should at least address the points I made previously about Bella's alleged maturity for her age, because that in and of itself is in no way a justification for a full grown ass adult, regardless of any supernaturality, to romantically pursue her. If nothing else, it's important to refute this argument simply because it's the exact same excuse used by actual child predators in the real world. If Edward was an adult human man and said the words, "You don't seem 17" to her, then there would be absolutely no question that his interest in her is predatory and wrong. But that's where the role of the teen vampire love interest gets messy, isn't it? Because Edward isn't the same as an adult human for numerous reasons, not least of which is that as a vampire, he is also a literal predator in the food chain sense of the word. If he was a Even if he was a brand new vampire and was actually 17, he would still pose a deadly threat to Bella, and the physical power imbalance between them would be the same. And yet, if he wasn't vastly older than her, would he feel the same entitlement to exert that power over her the way he does throughout the books, manhandling her, controlling her, and condescending to her? It's possible that he would, though we can't say for sure. We do know for sure, however, that Edward thinks of his high school classmates as children, and he does not entirely exempt Bella from this either. He doesn't think of them as his peers, not just because of the superiority complex over humans that seems to be par for the course for all Meyerpires, but also because he doesn't consider himself to be one of them anymore due to his age. And if we put every other factor aside for a moment, this right here, the fact that Edward does not consider himself to be a teenager, doesn't consider his girlfriend to be his peer, and calls attention to how much younger she is multiple times in a rather patronizing way, this right here breaks the fragile illusion for me that Edward's true age doesn't matter. Admittedly, though, that interpretation of Edward's character and his relationship with Bella is edging somewhat into death of the author territory, because Meyer clearly did not intend for him to come across as a patronizing and creepily possessive little shit or a pervy old man. As contradictory as his characterization may be, Edward is still fundamentally meant to be a teenager. An old fashioned gentleman who exists out of time, sure, but a perpetual 17-year-old nonetheless. Per Meyer's own canon, vampires are not just physically frozen in time at the point at which they return, but mentally as well. Although, as with her decree that half vampires are born with adult mentality, it's frustratingly difficult to extrapolate exactly what she's envisioning here. I know that plenty of other people have pointed out that vampires' brains literally being frozen in time would be logically impossible because it would prevent them from learning and processing any new information, but I personally don't find that to be a satisfactory argument. It relies on an extremely literal reading of Meyer's canon and doesn't allow for much suspension of disbelief when it comes to things that are only possible through magic anyway. While it's not entirely an unfair criticism, especially considering Meyer's insistence that her vamps are grounded in science, I will give her some leeway here. It is still fantasy after all, so while yes, it may be technically unrealistic for someone to be capable of learning new things while also maintaining the same base level of mental and emotional maturity, it's also unrealistic for walking corpses that drink blood to exist at all. Looking at vampires as a general media trope outside of just Twilight, I can generally accept that the notion that a vampire, especially one that was turned young, such as a child or a teen, would be internally stuck at the age of their death to at least some degree, and not fully be able to mature in the same way that they would if they had kept aging as a human. I'm not sure how controversial of an opinion this is, but I actually kind of prefer it when vampires are written with this in mind, as opposed to assuming that their mentalities would be completely divorced from their frozen physical age. When it's done well, that is. And the fact that writers so often fumble the ball in this regard is basically the whole reason for this video essay. And Meyer definitely fumbled it hard. In the hands of a better writer, we could have gotten a compelling and perhaps tragic glimpse into the mind of an immortal being who is capable of growing intellectually to an extent, but emotionally will never be able to fully outgrow the stage of adolescence that they were turned at. Hell, I could even understand Edward's seemingly contradictory flip flopping between grumpy geriatric and melodramatic teen if Meyer had made it clear in her writing that these contradictions were intentional, demonstrating that he is both and also neither of these things at the same time. Unfortunately, Meyer is not imaginative enough in her interpretation of vampire psychology to pull this off, and the characterization of Edward we end up with comes across as simply sloppy and inconsistent, probably because she did not have a consistent idea of what being stuck at the same mental age even meant. But I've already written over 5,000 words just on this one aspect of Twilight, and I'm so ready for these to be the last words I ever have to say on these damn books, so let's just move on to our next example already. Case study number 2, The Vampire Diaries. So yeah, that Twilight section ended up being way longer than I intended. I'll try not to retread too much ground that I already covered there, and I'll do my best not to ramble on for too long about the Vampire Diaries in general, but boy oh boy, there's just so much to say about this hot mess of a show. If you're in the mood for a 2 to 3 hour deep dive on TVD, then I highly recommend checking out Jenny Nicholson's or Friendly Space Ninja's videos on it. But for my part, I'll mainly be focusing on the show's fraught relationship, shall we say, with age gaps, power dynamics, abuse, and shipping. And since we're going to talk about shipping, then let me just say upfront that I've generally never been super invested in shipping as a concept when it comes to fandom. Except when it comes to Kirk and Spock, they are my OTP, and no, I will not be taking any questions on that today. There are certainly character pairings that I really like or root for in fiction, and plenty that I hate or don't think make any sense, but I generally try to be pretty chill about it, and I'm certainly not here to call anyone a terrible person for liking a ship that I don't. Like, if you're a big fan of Claraline, that's absolutely your right, and I respect it. Just as it's my right to find it creepy and off putting to watch the show develop a mutual attraction between a high schooler and a 1,000-year-old dude who is obsessed with her with nary a shred of self awareness. But I like to imagine that most Vampire Diaries fans from back when it first aired are old enough and wise enough now to not put any of the couples in this series on a pedestal, and it would be the height of hypocrisy for me to judge anyone for indulging in fan edits or fan fiction or whatever featuring two hot fictional characters together. That all being said, I'm sorry, but I can just never get behind Team Damon. Oh, hear me out. Just hear me out, okay? This is still a judgment free zone, and the point of all this is to emphasize the importance of looking at the media we enjoy and especially the media we create through a critical lens. because I do like Damon Salvatore as a character. Well, for the most part, anyway. I like him best early on in the show when he was allowed to be a villain with hidden depths and a potential path to redemption, before it became obvious that his redemption arc was less of an arc and more of a revolving door because the writers lacked the confidence or skill to fully commit to it without making him boring. But in the first two ish seasons, he was generally just really entertaining to watch as the sexy, funny, sarcastic asshole character who embraced the amorality of being a vampire. He was the type of guy that I loved to hate, but also just kind of loved to watch. And I have to admit, he was played with such charisma that I couldn't help but be torn between rooting for his redemption and wanting to see him get his comeuppance for the heinous things he did. But Leanne, you might be asking, if you like Damon so much, then why are you not on board the SS Delana? Well, viewers, it's not so much that I'm opposed to Damon and Elena specifically, as it is that I just can't force myself to ignore the elephant in the room to get on board with Damon and, well, anyone. Because for as entertaining as Damon's moral dubiousness can be, it really spoils any potential for me to enjoy a romantic storyline for his character when I remember that he is a rapist and an abuser of both underage girls and adult women, and a largely unrepentant one at that. And no, I refuse to pull my punches in that regard, because if we're going to discuss just how atrociously the Vampire Diaries fumbles the ball when it comes to their many, many questionable relationships, we must start by addressing Damon and Caroline. The Damon and Caroline relationship in early season 1 is actually a rather unique case as far as couples in the series go. It's one of the few that's not focused, at least not primarily, on fan service or testing out a possible OTP. More importantly, though, it's deliberately and blatantly framed as the abusive relationship that it is. Their characters are disturbed by how Damon treats Caroline, and the audience is meant to agree with them. And to the show's credit, I never got the sense that he was meant to be seen as a potential viable love interest for her in later seasons. Right from the get go, Damon only sees Caroline's as an object to be used, primarily as a tool to gain access to certain things that he wants, but also for sex. Caroline, who was largely characterized in the first season by craving for validation, attention, and affection, does largely fall prey to some good old fashioned emotional manipulation by him, but mostly Damon uses physical violence and literal mind control to keep her in line, which automatically voids any consent she could have given, apart from the fact that she is also underage. After he attempts to literally kill her and their relationship ends, she's left confused with holes in her memory of their time together and doesn't even remember that he's a vampire. She's emotionally traumatized but doesn't understand why, how, or even exactly what Damon did to her, which arguably makes the whole thing even more horrifying. Now, here's where things start to get messy, because up until the end of season 1, the writers did a pretty good job of showing how wrong and messed up this relationship was and using it as a vehicle to display Damon's villainy, give Bonnie and Elena a reason to hate and mistrust him, generate sympathies for the otherwise obnoxious Caroline, and kick off Caroline's character development. It also serves as a foil to Stefan and Elena's relationship. That is what Stefan could be doing to Elena if you're more like his brother, but because he loves her and respects human life in general so much, he would never dare take advantage of the power he has over her like that. And I think a good argument could be made that this contrast between the two couples was also intended to show the difference in how people deal with the trauma of having been in abusive relationships themselves. Damon, who still doesn't recognize what Catherine did to him and Stefan as abuse and manipulation, becomes an abuser himself, while Stefan deliberately chooses the opposite. There's definitely plenty of weirdness in Elena and Stefan's relationship as well, and I'll get deeper into Stefan's character in a bit, but my point here is that later developments in the show, particularly regarding Damon's character, are just so baffling and frustrating for me because of how surprisingly sensitive and realistic its portrayals of abuse were in season 1. And when I say sensitive, I don't mean they got everything right, of course, but man, going back to the early episodes, it's refreshing to see them let Caroline have conflicted feelings post Damon, but also commit to not ship teasing the two of them after that, and it's especially refreshing in its treatment of male victims of abuse. Seriously, my heart breaks for Stefan in the scene where he explains to Damon that it took him years to realize that Catherine had compelled them to love her and to come to terms with how deeply her manipulation affected him. But upon rewatching, I couldn't help noticing that the one thing that never comes up regarding these early depictions of abusive relationships is the question of age. As far as Catherine goes, I don't think we ever learn what her human age is supposed to be. She's identical to Elena, who starts the series at 17, but that doesn't necessarily indicate that her doppelganger is frozen at 17 as well. For all we know, Catherine could have been turned into a vampire when she was slightly older, but this ambiguity does make it pretty weird when you see her in relationships with 25-year-old Damon, 17-year-old Stefan, and Tyler's uncle, whose age is also ambiguous but looks to be in his late 20s or early 30s. And that's not even getting into the fact that she's actually about 500 years old and therefore much older than either of the Salvatores when she turned them. More significantly, though, Damon's age is not meant to be as ambiguous. While it's not clear if there's a specific age that he's pretending to be in the present day as a human, he was turned at 25, and even amongst a cast of people who are almost all comically too old to be playing convincing teenagers, it's pretty obvious that he's intended to be an adult compared to them. All the adult characters who don't know that he's a vampire clearly treat him like a grown up, and yet no one, not even Caroline's mom, who is the town sheriff, ever questions the fact that this grown ass man in his 20s is dating a 17-year-old in a show primarily aimed at teenagers. Yikes. To be fair, this is probably more of a CW thing than a vampire show specific thing, considering the age inappropriate shenanigans characters were getting up to in their other concurrently popular show, Gossip Girl. But come on, after a certain point, it's egregious not just how buck wild the age gaps in this show are, but also how not a single character in universe ever comments on it. Seriously, the only exception to this is Matt's mom drunkenly making out with Tyler, and the only consequences of them getting caught are Matt punching Tyler, but later going back to being friends with him and half heartedly admonishing his mom for being immature and embarrassing. So I guess when it's between a human adult and a teenager, it's kind of bad, but when it's between a super powerful immortal and a teenager, it's fine. Except, of course, for when that super powerful immortal is also physically abusive and using mind control on them. Sure, Vampire Diaries, sure. KVD really had zero regard for age when it came to characters hooking up. There really didn't seem to be any internal logic behind most pairings beyond two actors looking hot together. Every couple outside the main Stefan, Elaine, and Damon love triangle feels like the writers just spun a wheel and whichever heterosexual pairing it landed on would be the next secondary or tertiary romantic subplot they'd try out next. Like, Damon and Elena are supposed to be this epic love story, but I'm sorry, it's pretty thoroughly undermined for me by the fact that Damon previously had sex with Elena's biological mother, Isabel, before turning her into a vampire, and then Isabel's estranged husband, Alaric, became the new history teacher at school and started dating Elena's Aunt Jenna. Then, several years later, Alaric ended up briefly engaged to Elena's friend and his former high school student, Caroline, after a whole weird thing in which she was magically impregnated with his babies, and then Caroline, who you recall had previously been abused by Elena's true love, Damon, eventually marries Stefan, who is both Damon's brother and Elena's ex boyfriend. Oh, the mess. The mess of it all. And just as a sidebar, what the hell was it about the character of Caroline Forbes in particular that made her such a magnet for the most creepily age inappropriate dudes in the show? First Damon, then Klaus, then her former fucking high school teacher. Well, even with Stefan, arguably one of the healthiest matches for her out of anyone she dates, like we end up circling right back around to the Edward Cullen argument regarding his relationships with both her and with Elena. At least with Twilight, the author did intend for readers to interpret her teen vampires as being literally stuck as teens forever. Whether or not you as an individual reader can buy into that fully enough to justify Edward's relationship with Bella is another matter, but that is what she intended. With the Vampire Diaries, though, I have no idea what the hell we're supposed to believe about the mental and emotional maturity of its teenage vamps. Stefan is frozen at 17 and is Damon's younger brother, yet most of the time he's the more mature and level headed out of the two, while Damon, even on his best behavior, is still routinely impulsive, petty, selfish, and liable to throw deadly temper tantrums when things don't go his way. Actually, that pretty well describes a lot of the vampire characters on the show and a lot of the non-vampire characters too, for that matter, minus the deadly temper tantrums, of course, usually. Pretty much everyone on the show was equally prone to acting extremely childish, which, in addition to being played by adult actors that even in the first season are difficult to buy as teens, I think it does kind of muddy the waters when it comes to the appropriateness of various pairings. But going back to Stefan specifically, I have to admit it's hard not to find him much better boyfriend material than Edward Cullen, so long as we can ignore his serial killer past that the show tries to handwave with the whole humanity switch bullshit that is way too complicated to get into here. And I know a lot of people think he's boring and not enough of a sexy bad boy apart from the serial killer thing that we're ignoring, and I don't mean to sound like a Stelena shipper or anything, but if I were forced at gunpoint to ship Elena with anyone in the show, then I guess it would have to be Stefan. Compared to so many other characters in the show, it's hard not to see his relative maturity and heroic do gooder nature as selling points. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to call him a cinnamon roll character, but he's at least the closest one to it on TVD, and I do have a soft spot for cinnamon roll characters, especially if they have a bit of an edge, which I will agree with Friendly Space Ninja that Stefan does have. At the very least, he respects Elena's free will, unlike Edward with Bella, or hell, unlike Damon most of the time. And he makes a habit of being honest with Elena, unlike plenty of vampire love interests I could name. Well, he does hide the fact that he's a vampire from her at first, and lie about his backstory, but it's not like that's something you can just blurt out on a first date, right? Oh, and I guess he also doesn't tell her about being identical to his evil ex, Catherine, or about how he stalked her a bit before formally meeting her to make sure that she wasn't like Catherine, or about the time when he used to be a serial killer, but we're supposed to be ignoring that last bit, remember? All right, fine. So maybe Stefan isn't Mr. Honesty all the time, but considering the company he keeps in this show and in this genre overall, I guess the fact that he at least doesn't hold anything back once his secrets are exposed, and the fact that he doesn't try to keep Elena out of the loop regarding things that directly affect her counts for something. Bare minimum achieved. Way to go. But yeah, I do recognize that my half hearted defenses of Team Stefan are flimsy at best because he's still 150 years older than Elena and Caroline, and I still can't figure out the extent to which we're meant to view him as a teenager. On paper, the fact that he is relatively grounded and mature might be a selling point, but I have to keep reminding myself that while watching, that much of his maturity undoubtedly comes from being an old ass grandpa compared to Elena. Maybe it's just the difference between reading a novel and watching a TV show. Maybe my perspective is biased because I didn't start watching TVD when I was still a teen myself. Or maybe it's just the fact that Paul Wesley was about a decade older than Stefan is supposed to be, and he looks it, but it's extremely easy to forget that he's meant to be stuck at 17. And either the writers kept forgetting that too, or they just had no clear idea of how the mental maturity of vampires was supposed to work, because Stefan and Catherine aren't the only characters who get this ambiguous treatment. Rebecca Michelson is probably the best example of this in the show. Rebecca is 1,000 years old and also an original, meaning that she's one of the oldest and most powerful vampires in existence. She's also meant to be frozen at the age of about 16 or 17. She dates Stefan for a while in the 1920s, hooks up with Damon at least once, I'm pretty sure, and has a strange and nonsensical fling with Matt, who is human and also 18. She starts going to high school just because she feels like it, and apart from Caroline, is the one who seems to care most about having mundane and modern teen experiences like going to prom and cheerleading and being the queen bee of the school. She also tends to act like a petulant, spoiled brat, to the point where she can almost seem more like she's 12, though with vanishingly rare moments when she comes close to seeming like a genuine old soul. And keep in mind here that I have not actually seen the originals. I'm only basing this off of what I recall of Rebecca's characterization in the original Vampire Diaries. I from what I've heard, she does seem to go through some character growth in the originals, but I have not watched that, not yet at least, so just bear that in mind. I don't know what the general fandom consensus is on Rebecca. Personally, I find her juvenile antics to be extremely annoying. Honestly, I kind of appreciate what I think they were trying to do with her character. Show that even after having been around for 1,000 years, she's still just a young girl at heart. And over the centuries, she's grown resentful that that's all she'll ever be, which causes her to act out. Yeah, she's immature and annoying, but she also can't entirely help it because she's been denied the ability to ever fully grow out of it, you know? Except any excuses you could make for Rebecca's behavior are ruined for me because, number one, she's probably the most immature and stereotypically bratty teen character in the entire show, apart from maybe Jeremy. And number two, she's the only long lived vampire that the writers seemingly went out of their way to depict as having a level of an emotional maturity to roughly match her physical age. I know I said before that a lot of the characters on the show are prone to acting childish, but at least the other characters usually are literal teenagers who are simply acting their age. And even when that isn't the case, it's typically a result of forced melodrama that unintentionally makes the characters come across as immature. The intentionality that I read into Rebecca's characterization is just so weird and frustrating because I get the sense that her juvenile personality is supposed to be a clear indication that vampires are canonically mentally frozen in time. Yet it contradicts what we've already seen up to that point in the series with the likes of Stefan and Catherine. To be fair, you could also probably interpret Anna's character in a similar light. She meant to be frozen at about 15 or 16, and she reads as pretty young given the way her hair and clothes are styled, and also because the context she exists in entirely revolves around her mother and her teen boyfriend Jeremy. Like Rebecca, she also willingly starts going to high school, though in her case, it mostly seems to be so that she and Jeremy can spend more time together. Unfortunately, her role in the show is so limited and short lived that it's hard to get a clear read on her personality and maturity level. Though I will say that she generally seems more independent than Rebecca, who only ever seems to lurk in the shadow of Klaus and her other older brothers, while Anna has been forced to operate independently for over a century while searching for a way to rescue her vampire mom. And apart from missing her mom and crushing on Jeremy, she seems pretty comfortable flying solo. But just like Rebecca's immature personality stood out for me as almost certainly deliberate, I also couldn't help but notice upon rewatching just how much Anna stands out in her youthful, girlish style and dress. Sure, pretty much the whole cast is dressed in realistic, casual teen fashion from the late 2000s and early 2010s, but coming at this from an adult perspective, it's hard not to notice just how unsexualized, shall we say, she is by comparison. There's a whole separate discussion to be had about the issues that arise from the trend of casting actors in their 20s in teen dramas and putting them in explicit sexual situations and sexy outfits. But suffice it to say that the TVD showrunners definitely capitalized on the sex appeal of their cast in the eyes of both their teen and adult viewers by dressing them up in revealing clothes and showing them in various states of undress, with Anna being a notable exception. You could see how a 16-year-old boy would find her attractive, but she's certainly not framed as someone that it's okay for viewers to ogle. I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to say here or if I'm reading into things too much, but it's interesting to me that the only two solid examples of vampires being shown through various means to be more or less stuck as teenagers are both female. Make of that what you will. I think it's worth having bit of a discussion about how TVD tried to appeal to an adult audience while also being a show primarily targeted at teenagers, because I think it was this executive level of decision making that guided the character writing choices far more so than any cohesive internal logic about how vampire psychology works. Let's be real here. It's extremely easy to forget that even the human characters are supposed to be in high school most of the time. Did these kids even have classes other than history? They never do any homework in between worrying about world ending problems. Most of them seem pretty self sufficient and have a lot of freedom. Everyone is always hanging out at the local bar and grill, and only very few of their parents are both still alive and also somewhat actively involved in the plot. For the first four seasons, Mystic Falls High is basically just a convenient way to have the main characters be a tight knit friend group with plenty of excuses to spend all their time together without full time jobs or raising a family getting in the way. Sure, every half a season or so, some big dramatic story beat will happen at the school dance or pep rally, but the high school might as well be Mystic Falls Community College, considering how little the major concerns of the characters usually relate to the experience of adolescence. Seriously, though, why not just have the show set on a college campus instead of in a small town high school? I know, the CW is trying to cash in on the Twilight craze and capture the teen audience that was thirsting for more hot vampire boys. And I know the original Vampire Diaries books were young adult novels, but TVD the show is pretty much just an adaptation in name only anyway. And it's not like its more grown up counterpart on HBO, True Blood, wasn't a runaway success with adult audiences. Then again, I suppose if the Vampire Diaries had been aiming for a slightly more mature audience, it might have suffered by being in slightly more direct competition with True Blood, but setting it in a college town with a more specific focus on characters in their early 20s as undergrad or possibly graduate students would have given it some unique flair, I think. Plus, who knows, maybe it could have captured the demographic of people who had read the original 90s novels before the popularity of Twilight rekindled widespread interest in them. At least the weird, creepy age gaps and inconsistent teenager nests of the characters in it would be a lot less so if they weren't all forced into being high school students for the first four seasons. But the fact remains that The Vampire Diaries was a teen drama aimed at a primarily teen audience, and as such, I think it's especially important to consider the kind of intentional and unintentional messages that such a show sends to its impressionable viewers. And yes, I do realize that it's essentially impossible to write a teen vampire romance that isn't at least somewhat problematic because huge power imbalances are inherent to the genre, and justifying a supernatural age gap is always going to require a lot of hand waving and suspension of disbelief. But as I already went over, a lot of the concerns raised by relationships in the show aren't necessarily about the explicitly supernatural aspect, but about more mundane abuse and predation. It's great that the show doesn't try to ship Caroline and Damon after she turns into a vampire and gets her memories back, and I appreciate that they actually had Caroline object to Elena's eventual relationship with him on those grounds. But it rings extremely hollow when not a single adult or teen character on the show flags up how wrong it was for this alleged 25-year-old to be dating either one of them. What particularly leaves a bad taste in my mouth is the fact that the other kids not recognizing Damon dating 17-year-old Caroline, or any of the super old vampires pursuing teenagers for that matter, as creepy and gross, isn't even that inaccurate to real life. I remember when I was in high school, I had a classmate who started dating a 20 or 21-year-old when they were 15 or 16. And even though I might have thought it was a bit unusual at the time, none of us in our grade really thought much of it. It wasn't until I was about 20 myself that I thought about it again, and it struck me just how much of a red flag we'd all missed. And that's normal for teenagers to think that way. At that age, we overlook clear warning signs, overestimate our own maturity, and tend to characterize abuse and toxic relationships in simplistic terms during our formative years because that's just the nature of being an adolescent. And it's not an at all uncommon thing for teens to view dating an older person as cool or as a status symbol, and not realize until later in life how emotionally damaging being in such a relationship might have been. Which is why it's on the adult in that scenario to not date a teenager. Not to get all up on my soapbox or anything, but I think it's also on the writers of teen dramas to depict these kind of predatory age gap relationships in a responsible way that doesn't end up inadvertently condoning them. That's pretty applicable advice for teen shows of any genre, but here's where things get sticky again because we are in the realm of the supernatural here. It's so tempting to say that I wish the Vampire Diaries would have gone out of its way to show Caroline's mom or any of the adults objecting to her relationship with Damon and explicitly calling him out for being a grown ass man in his 20s taking advantage of a teen girl. But I think the reason why the writers shied away from condemning the mundane age gap of their relationship and instead leaned more into the vampire with his humanity switched off part of Damon's abuse was that doing so would risk making them look like hypocrites for endorsing a whole host of vampire human relationships with age gaps on the scale of centuries. I'm not sure if this is a conscious motivation, and making sure that Damon could be positioned as a viable love interest for Elena certainly played a big part in glossing over his abuse of Caroline, but I have my suspicions. Even if the show did have a clear stance on the degree to which vampires are mentally and emotionally stuck at the age at which they were turned, having an audience accept in good faith that Stefan and Rebecca and Anna and so on really are literally teenagers forever in order to justify their relationships with actual teenagers is still so much more easily said than done. And if that is what they were trying to convey, then it was a flaccid attempt made all the more insincere by the show's blatant disregard for age, period. The Vampire Diaries operates on the very simple philosophy of whichever hetero couple looks hot together, which is fine for a show about adults that's made for adults, except, it's not one of those shows, which opens it up to a lot of nuanced discussion on age and problematic relationships that it is not willing to engage in, sadly. Case study number three, True Blood. Ah, True Blood, the Vampire Diaries' older, weirder cousin and HBO's big fantasy hit before Game of Thrones came along. I have a lot of complicated love for the show and a lot to say about it, which I do plan on doing hopefully in the near future. But there's one aspect of the show that I'd like to focus on for now, that being the character of Jessica Hamby. Once again, I'm not really sure if there's much of a fandom consensus on Jessica, but I personally like her a lot. She's one of my favorite characters. She can be a little annoying at times, especially early on, but it's firmly established that she's supposed to be that way. It's amusing to watch her push Bill's buttons as he fumbles through trying to be a vampire dad to her, and to Jessica's credit, and more importantly the writer's credit, she does undergo a good bit of character growth. But more importantly, for the purposes of this video, the reason why she goes through a sulky brat phase early on is because, well, she's simply just a teenage girl who got turned into a vampire against her will and is struggling to come to terms with that. Just how Jessica deals with becoming a vampire is compelling to watch. Of course, it's not like we don't also have multiple examples of newly turned teen vamps in the Vampire Diaries as well, but I think Jessica's storyline has a bit of an edge over her TVD counterparts in how it demonstrates just how much of a struggle the transition from human to immortal is, especially when it's been forced on someone at such a young age who also had an extremely sheltered and abusive upbringing. And within the context of True Blood specifically, Jessica is unique because she's not only one of the few non adult characters in the show, but also one of the few newborn vampires we get to see until about season 5, and arguably the only one who gets to have a fully fleshed out arc after being turned. Oh, Tara. I have a lot to say about how they screwed over her character once I finally get around to making a full True Blood video. Through Jessica, we get to see the harsh reality of being turned into a supernatural abomination and having one's entire future ripped away at what is already a critical moment of change in a young person's life. But we also get to see the ways in which she is empowered and comes into her own as she embraces her vampiric nature. And this is all great stuff. I like that Jessica is allowed to be messy and immature and make mistakes, but then also learn and grow as a person. I appreciate that the show just lets her be a realistic 17-year-old girl despite her fantastical circumstances. Jessica is honestly just a very well written character, and I so wish that I could just heap tons of praise on the True Blood writers in this regard, but there's the teensy little issue of her relationship with Hoyt that I cannot let slide. It's worth pointing out that True Blood in general has a much different approach to relationships than The Vampire Diaries or Twilight. Maybe it's just that it's a more adult series with an overall more cynical, albeit deliciously campy tone, but it's much less focused on romance and promoting specific couples as meant to be than its young adult contemporaries. Sure, romantic relationships are central to the show when the Bill Sookie romance more or less kicks off the whole plot, but the writers were pretty blunt about showing almost every couple as toxic or unhealthy in some way, and even the healthiest and most stable pairings were usually doomed not to last. So, while the show tends to be pretty matter of fact about its relationships and seems to even derive a certain amount of twisted pleasure from having them blow up in the characters' faces, one of the few arguable exceptions to this rule was the relationship between Jessica and Hoyt. For whatever reason, they were the one couple that the writers just could not seem to bear having break up permanently. Oh, and I suppose I haven't yet clarified that Hoyt is 28 when he starts dating 17-year-old Jessica. Yeah, it's not great. And I just have to ask HBO, Alan Ball, whoever in the writers' room is responsible for this, Why? Just why? Why did you need to have a dude in his late 20s fall in love with an underage girl 11 years his junior? Hell, for that matter, why did it happen to the same girl twice? Because it's not like the constant teasing of Jessica and Jason was any better. Hell, it's arguably worse considering they had to make her cheat on Hoyt for it to happen. So I guess at the very least, she was technically 18 at that point and knew herself well enough by then to not immediately jump into a relationship with Jason after breaking up with Hoyt, which is more than I can say for Sookie and or Jason himself. And I can't believe I'm using Jessica and Jason's fuck buddy type situation as a positive comparison compared to other examples in the show. But the point is that Jessica's love life is so much more unsettling than I think the writers intended, and it just that I honestly don't know what they intended exactly, especially considering that Hoyt and Jessica ultimately were endgame per the show's much reviled finale. I think I might be asking the wrong questions, though. Because while it's completely baffling to me just what the hell the writers were thinking and not only trying to shove Jessica and Jason together, but especially having her marry Hoyt in the end, it's clear that they did actually put thought into how Hoyt and Jessica's relationship would come across. Recently, I've been listening to the Truest Blood podcast hosted by Kristen Bauer, who plays Pam, and Deborah Ann Wool, who plays Jessica. In discussing the beginnings of her relationship with Hoyt, just Deborah Ann Wool talks about how there were concerns about the age inappropriateness of it during production, and so it was decided that the age difference would be glossed over and the species difference played up. And I do kind of have to hand it to True Blood. They certainly did do a good job of putting an ironic twist on the stereotype of the naive, innocent virgin with an overprotective dad. As Bill explains to Hoyt, it's not him taking advantage of her that he's worried about, it's Jessica potentially killing him. She might just be a sheltered 17-year-old and only a couple weeks old as a vampire, but her being a vampire puts Hoyt at risk of being drained like a Capri Sun if she gets a little too frisky and loses control. Not only that, but the physical power balance is tipped in her favor to an insane degree, and it'll take no effort at all for her to overpower him. And on top of all that, vampires also have the power of mind control, which Jessica does actually use on him in a particularly low moment to make him forget being mad at her for feeding on another guy, an act that's characterized as cheating. Thing is, though, just because the relationship is unequal in one way in Jessica's favor, it still doesn't negate the fact that she is a teenager and Hoyt is a grown ass man. Like Edward, she might be a literal predator in the food chain sense of the word, but it can't be emphasized enough that unlike the previous examples in this video, she doesn't just look 17 while actually being over 100, she literally is still 17. And I'm sorry for being so blunt, but it honestly makes me really uncomfortable just how many people, including the writers of the show, perfectly fine excusing an adolescent dating a guy 11 years older because their superhuman abilities make it all okay. Hell, even in the show, I can't recall a single character ever pointing out how strange their age difference is. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure if this can be chalked up to the emphasis put on Jessica being a dangerous vampire or the writer seemingly forgetting how old she's supposed to be, or a little bit of both. Although I'd hazard a guess, it's probably both. Just why exactly are viewers supposed to take it for granted that Jessica being a vampire means that her young age doesn't matter? Is it because we're meant to rest assured that her superhuman strength and abilities mean that she's safe from being taken advantage of by a partner? Is it because she's portrayed as the sexual aggressor and the dominant partner when she first meets Hoyt and later has sex with Jason? Is it because she and Hoyt are portrayed as equals in terms of their emotional maturity level and inexperience with relationships? Again, I'm inclined to believe that the answer is all of the above, but each of these justifications is worth dissecting on their own. To start with, we have the issue of Jessica being the dominant, sexually forward one with her older partners. I'll just get this excuse out of the way first, since it's the most straightforward to refute, as well as the most important due to its applicability to real life. To reiterate what I said earlier about Edward's creepily condescending attitude toward the much younger Bella, if you disregard the supernatural aspect, then it becomes impossible to ignore just how weird and wrong the age difference is between Jessica and both Hoyt and Jason. And to expand upon a point I made earlier about the Vampire Diaries, especially regarding Caroline and Damon, it doesn't matter if the minor partner is the one doing the seducing or initiating sex or relationship, it's the responsibility of the adult to not encourage or reciprocate their sexual advances. And yes, I know that the knee jerk rebuttal to this is that Jessica's strength and glamoring ability mean that she's theoretically the one with all the power, and that Hoyt being just as sexually inexperienced as she is and letting her take the lead neutralizes their age difference. Except it doesn't neutralize it really. All it does is perpetuate the harmful media trope that a minor character acting seemingly mature, displaying sexual confidence, and actively going after what they want makes it somehow okay, or at least less bad for the adult they're pursuing to engage in a relationship with them. When in reality, number one, this is hardly ever the case to begin with, and number two, it doesn't change the fact that the minor in the situation does not have the life experience and cognitive development to appreciate what they're getting themselves into in the way that an adult in the situation does. Then there's the idea that the show seems to want to play up that Jessica and Hoyt are equals in some regard due to both of them being kind of sheltered, emotional adolescents with no relationship experience. In the early days of their relationship, it's portrayed as being a very sweet and innocent first love. A little cheesy and sappy, perhaps, but in a purposeful way that's meant to make you go, aw, look how cute they are, while reminiscing about your own first love. And I've gotta say, the first time I watched the show and could manage to turn my brain off and forget the age gap, especially when I didn't know yet exactly how much older Hoyt was, there were quite a few adorable and heartwarming moments between them that managed to hook me. Their naive, fumbling, but sincere romance in seasons 2 and 3 makes for a refreshing change of pace when contrasted with the dark and cynical world around them, and not to mention the relentless drama of Sookie and Bill. If you erase their respective ages from your mind, then it's pretty easy to root for them in the beginning. They're just two crazy kids in love who've been chafing at their restrictive home lives and found something in common with each other, not to mention a partner that won't judge them for their lack of experience. And then I find myself abruptly jolted out of that rose tinted view and remember that they aren't two crazy kids in love, or at least only one of them is. Yeah, Hoyt might act like and come across as a teenage boy much of the time, but it's just a nicer way of saying that he's a man child who's been babied and smothered and emotionally stunted by his overbearing mother. Seriously, considering the other side of Hoyt we see in season 5, I'm kind of surprised the writers didn't lean into him being two steps away from going full on Norman Bates. I mean, seriously, thank God they didn't go there with his character, but regardless, it's pretty clear to see that his relationship with Jessica largely boils down to him projecting his mommy issues onto her. It's like him engaging in a bit of teenage rebellion by dating what mommy hates, in this case, a vampire. And at first, it's hard not to sympathize with Hoyt to an extent, considering he's been nothing but a shy, sweet guy so far, and who doesn't love to hate Maxine Fortenberry? But it isn't teenage rebellion in anyone's eyes except for Maxine's, though, because Hoyt is not a teenager. I can't emphasize this enough. He's not a teenager. And playing up his sexual inexperience and the fact that his emotional maturity has been stunted by being kept under his mother's thumb well into his 20s does not change that. Sure, his and Jessica's respective upbringings give him something to relate to in one another, and they're both virgins, but that doesn't make Hoyt's life experience equivalent to hers. Hoyt still has over a decade of lived experience on her. He has grown up friends and a grown up job, and despite living with his mom, he's implied to be the breadwinner of the house and has grown up responsibilities like paying the phone bill. His lack of a love life also seems to be largely a matter of choice, since he says he's waiting for the right girl to come along, indicating that he's looking for someone to settle down with and is pretty confident in what he wants from a relationship. None of this makes him remotely comparable to a literal teenager with a very strict conservative Christian upbringing, nor does it justify him dating one just because he's written as being on her emotional level. Plenty of people have thrown around some variation of the saying, if he's hanging around with high school girls, it's probably because women his own age find him too immature, and it's almost hilarious how literally True Blood portrays this with Hoyt and Jessica. Though just how intentional and self aware the show was in this regard is impossible to say. It seems to vary across the seasons and depend on the writer of a given episode. Just like in the Vampire Diaries, none of the other characters seem to pick up on or comment on this dynamic, however. Which brings us to the issue of Jessica's physical near invulnerability versus her emotional and mental vulnerability. While the writers may seem to occasionally forget that she's supposed to be only 18 or 19 at most by the end of the show, in season 2 they were still very much aware of her young age, and it's very apparent from her mannerisms, behavior, and the way most people treat her that she's very much still an adolescent. In a particularly noteworthy conversation between Bill and Sookie about the changes Jessica is going through, the vampiric transformation is likened to a second, more extreme puberty, complete with a sardonic reminder from Sookie that Jessica is still technically in the midst of regular puberty on top of that. Just a quick aside, though, I do have to wonder to what extent that teen vamps can actually be considered to be going through puberty to begin with. Like, the whole point of puberty is that it's a period of transition from child to adult in which the body undergoes wild hormonal and physiological changes that are meant to prepare the body to be able to procreate. But vampires, by definition, are magically animated dead bodies who can't have children, and presumably their hormone levels aren't in flux because they don't have need for hormones anymore, so therefore, technically, they wouldn't be a reason for a vampire to experience the same unpredictable emotions that a normal teenager might. Then again, the same should hold true of vampires who are adults, and they really shouldn't be able to feel anything without serotonin and dopamine and whatever. Then again, the show is deliberately mysterious about this and chalks it all up to magic anyway, with Bill's explanation that he doesn't have brainwaves and doesn't know what animates vampires beyond blood. So, if we can accept that vampires exist in the first place, then we can accept that a teenage vampire could still experience the emotional roller coaster that comes as a package deal with the changes of their growing body, even though by definition their body is no longer growing or changing. Sometimes the answer really is just magic, and that's perfectly fine. Yes, I'm looking at you again, Stephanie Meyer. You see the kind of things you have to consider when you over explain your supernatural creatures and try to make them as scientific and logical as possible? You see why people get annoyed and call you out on your inevitable science fails after you've sucked the magic out of magic? Ahem. Yeah, sorry about that, guys. Looks like my inner anti-Twihard from 10 years ago still has a few things to get off her chest. But I promise it won't happen again. What was I talking about? Right. The point of this scene, and many other early Jessica centric scenes, is that not only is she an adolescent with a lot of deeply repressed feelings and desires suddenly coming to the forefront, but being a newly turned vampire has multiplied these feelings exponentially and added superpowers and a terrifying new lust for blood and violence on top of that. She's emotionally volatile with poor impulse control, two things that she can't really help because of what she's going through, though she does make progress on her self control over time, and Bill isn't wrong that this makes her dangerous. But it doesn't just make her dangerous, it also makes her quite vulnerable. Jessica has never been in a relationship, and presumably her only relationship role models have been her abusive dad and her mom, who was both abused herself and also enabled his abuse of Jessica and her sister. Growing up in this kind of household undoubtedly left her with a deep seated craving for the love, protection, and affection that was absent from her childhood. At the same time, this toxic upbringing is the only kind of love she's ever known, and being ripped away from her family is as confusing and painful as it is liberating. She also just has a ton of repressed sexual urges that have been magnified by becoming a vampire, and if there's anyone more reckless than a horny teen who's probably only ever had abstinence only sex ed at best, it's a horny teen who's suddenly been set free from the constraints of human social norms and values because they're undead now. And not only has Jessica's horny teen recklessness been compounded by the poor impulse control inherent to all baby vampires, early on it's hard for her to even comprehend why she should bother controlling her impulses. From her naive and inexperienced perspective, being an ultra powerful vampire should mean that she gets to do whatever she wants. Taking all of this together, is it any wonder why she latches on to the first seemingly sweet guy who shows genuine interest in her almost immediately after being turned? Is it any wonder why she can't help but be worn down by Hoyt's persistence after they already broke up, and why she dives headfirst into moving in with him when, per the show's timeline, they've only known each other for a couple weeks at most and have broken up for most of that time? Now, granted, most couples on the show also move at lightning speed, but they usually also fall apart just as quickly or end in someone's untimely death. But while Hoyt and Jessica stayed together over the year-long time skip between seasons 3 and 4, is it also any wonder why their relationship falls apart so spectacularly once the honeymoon phase is over and Jessica's had a bit of time to grow up and think about her wants and needs? Yes, both of them are immature, and Hope's man-baby attitude contributes just as much to to their failure as Jessica's immaturity, if not more so. Yes, Jessica makes a lot of mistakes that I'm not trying to excuse. She does cheat on him by feeding on someone else in a moment of frustration and having to oppress her vampiric nature and kissing Jason in an emotionally charged moment after almost dying and mind wiping her boyfriend to make him forget about the former is pretty heinous. The mistreatment in their relationship is not a one way street, but that's kind of my point. Because while Jessica being young, inexperienced, impulsive, and emotionally volatile doesn't excuse her actions, I'd argue that it does at least go a long way toward explaining them. At the very least, her frustrations and actions, except for maybe the mind wiping, are more understandable than Hoyt's, who was a grown ass man with no business dating a teenager in the first place, let alone expecting her to take care of him like his mother. And that's before all the jaw-droppingly horrible stuff he does in season 5 that I don't even want to get into right now. But let's just say that joining a violent hate group, nearly murdering his ex-girlfriend after said hate group kidnaps her for the explicit purpose of murdering her, and then demanding that she erase all his memories of both her and Jason because he refuses to let go of his hurt feelings like an adult is not a great look. Even for all her faults as a romantic partner, Jessica still comes out looking like the much more mature one. She's ultimately the one to break up with Hoyt after realizing they aren't compatible and is honest with him that she doesn't think she's cut out for the type of monogamous relationship he wants. It doesn't undo any of the hurt she caused him or the fact that she erased his memory of her cheating, but she does what's best for both of them in the long run, isn't cruel about it, and in response, Hoyt throws a tantrum and treats her like absolute garbage. Which is honestly a pretty realistic ending for their relationship, not to mention a pretty thematically and narratively appropriate one given the overall tone of the show. And it could have worked really well, if only it had stuck. I wouldn't be writing all this if only Hoyt had left the show after season 4 and Jessica had been allowed to truly move on and hadn't also been saddled with Jason being awkwardly kind of sort of in love with her. But alas, I will just have to go on believing in my personal headcanon that season 7 never happened. Of course, all of this still doesn't answer the key question about teen vamps in True Blood's canon that was more central to the discussions of Twilight and the Vampire Diaries. Will Jessica actually be able to fully grow up mentally and emotionally over time? Or will she always be a moody and impulsive teenager to at least some degree? Considering True Blood is an adult focused show and Jessica is a doubly unique character by being both young to begin with as well as a brand new vampire, we have very few examples to go off of. But considering the few that we do have, I'm inclined to believe that in the show's universe, vampires do continue to mature emotionally regardless of their physical human age. Whether or not their human age, specifically if they returned as a child or a teenager, has at least some effect on their maturity is impossible to say though. The only unambiguous example of a child vampire I recall from the entire show is the little boy who is part of the Authority, aka the vampire government, in season 5 and looks like he's about 10. Obviously, the implication here is that he's actually centuries old and therefore commands the same level of respect as any other immortal who's been around for that long. Whether this means that his brain continued to mature as it normally would while being stuck in a child's body, much like Claudia, for example, in Interview with the Vampire, or if he maintained a more childlike mentality for longer but slowly grew into a sort of vampiric adulthood, or if he exists in a somewhat liminal space where he has both adult and childlike characteristics, isn't made clear since he barely exists as a character. However, True Blood does have one quite prominent youthful vampire character who could serve as an example of Jessica's potential to continue to grow mentally into a mature adult, that of Godric, Eric's maker. Godric's total screen time is short but significant, giving us a clear picture of who he is in the present and leaving a lasting impression on the show. Despite his young appearance, you will definitely buy him as being 2,000 years old because Alan Hyde sells the hell out of him being this somber, introspective, wise old soul. Godric is meant to be an exception to the rule that most vampires in the show are, in fact, quite petty, cruel, selfish, and just plain whiny little babies due to their sense of entitlement that goes along with being powerful and immortal. Again, these people are all adults to begin with, and what makes him exceptional is that he proves that maybe these traits aren't necessarily inherent to vampire nature. That it is possible to grow the fuck up, care about others, and just, be better. Just how old he was meant to be when he was turned is never clearly stated in the show. Obviously, his human age is meant to be pretty young compared to that of most other vampires. We see since Hyde was 19 when he was cast in the role, and Kristen Bauer states in the podcast that he's meant to be 15 according to the script, which is admittedly a lot younger than I would have guessed. Even before I knew how old the actor was, I would have put Godric down for as being in his late teens or maybe his early 20s. Also, it's impossible to say to what extent, if any, his young human age affected his personal growth since, number one, we really have no idea what he was like in his early years as a vampire. Number two, 2,000 years is a damn long time, and I find it hard to believe that someone's personality and level of emotional maturity could remain completely stagnant over that long, regardless of the life stage they were turned at. And number three, Godric would have been born into a time and culture so entirely alien to our own that comparing his human or baby vampire self to a more modern day teenager like Jessica isn't exactly a simple matter. Either way, Godric being arguably the most emotionally evolved character in the entire goddamn show does at least seem to settle the question as to whether or not teenage vampires are capable of growing up, so to speak, in the world of True Blood. But just for argument's sake, let's take Meyer's explanation at face value. Who, then, would it be appropriate for someone like Edward Cullen to date? I suppose the simplest answer would be another teen vampire who has also been a vampire for a similar length of time as him, since that's really the only situation in which the power balance between both partners would be as equal as possible in terms of emotional maturity, lived experience, and physical strength. Alice and Jasper are the main example that comes to mind as a couple that met each other after they were both already vampires and seemingly meet this criteria. In universe, however, vampires tend to be pretty spread out and don't have much in the way of a cohesive community or society, so I'll grant that finding a romantic partner of similar age amongst one's own kind could be kind of difficult for a Meyerpire. What about another vampire that was turned as an adult, though? If we take it at face value that Edward does have the mentality of a 17-year-old forever, then surely it would be pretty sketchy to pair him up with someone who was, say, 27 forever, right? Or would their relative vampiric age also play a factor, with the human age difference being less problematic if Edward had lived for much longer as a vampire while the technical adult was still practically a newborn? Metatextually speaking, though, vampire romances are pretty rare actually among main couples in fiction, with vampire mortal being the more typical pairing. So let's focus on that. What if Bella had been 21 or 22 and they'd met in college rather than high school? I don't think this is a scenario I've come across much in fiction, although there are some ambiguous situations that might count as this in the Vampire Diaries, and I can see why writers might shy away from this dynamic because the optics of it look problematic in the opposite way of Bella and Edward's canon relationship. A relationship between a 21-year-old and an actual 17-year-old in real life would certainly raise red flags for a lot of people for good reason. And if you interpret Meyer's canon very literally and assume that the teen vampire partner in this scenario will forever and always be immature compared to the moral 21-year-old, then I suppose that we must consider such a relationship to be problematic from that perspective. But considering Canon Edward has gone through college and grad school more than once and would still have much more lived experience than our theoretical early 20s Bella, would it be such a stretch to imagine that Meyer Pyre psychology is elastic enough to allow for some mental and emotional growth? If we allow for just a bit of wiggle room in Meyer's canon, then, in a convoluted sense, I guess a person in their early 20s might just be the most ethical and least gross human love interest for a vampire in their late teens, just so long as the prospective writer manages to not dwell on the character's eternal youth in a fetishistic way. Am I advocating specifically for more depictions of this in media? No, not really, though mainly because I myself am personally more interested in adult vampires anyway. Life really is so much simpler when you're not writing teen vampires and having to do mental gymnastics to justify the ethics of their relationships with humans of any age. But what if Bella was even older than 21 or 22, though? Maybe in her 30s? Obviously, this is a hypothetical with no definitive answer, though I personally do think it would be extremely weird and uncomfortable, and I encourage you all to argue about it in the comments to your heart's content.